Hi everyone, welcome to my 5.1 evidence for evolution video. I've tried to summarize everything as much as possible. If you want to have a look, an easy pause it now and have a quick read through if you want to. Okay, so the first section is the evidence that we can get from fossils to provide evidence for evolution. So we should know already from previous studies that fossils are the remains of plants and animals from millions of years ago. So we've got some examples of fossils here. We've got the classic skeletal bone fossils. We've got amber fossils here. So that's where small organisms become trapped in cell sap that turns into amber. Think Jurassic Park. And we've got here some imprints from 3 different types of organisms. So you've got a fish at the top here, a leaf and a spider. So imprints can also be classed as fossils. You can look at things like footprints as well. The fossils can include bones or whole organisms or imprints, as I was saying. And the way that we date fossils is we look at the rock that they're found in. So as rock forms, it forms in different layers depending on when it forms and the environmental conditions when it forms. So if you have a look at this picture just here, you can see in this rock face there's lots of different layers depending on when the layers formed. And then in this graphic here, you can see that there's different fossils in different layers. And we can use carbon dating to date the rock and therefore find out the approximate age of the fossils. When we find fossils, each fossil is fitted into the fossil record, and when we do that, it helps us to look at the evolutionary history of an organism, so we can see how that organism has evolved and changed over time as a result of its environment and competition. Okay, so selective breeding can also provide some evidence for evolution. It's the process whereby humans choose individuals within a population that have desirable traits. So it can most traditionally happens with animals. If you think about different breeds of dog, so dogs all used to be the same, but we've bred them all to be different and have different specific traits depending on what humans wanted. When selective breeding occurs, the desired alleles are going to be passed on to the offspring. So we want to keep desired alleles. We want to get rid of alleles that have undesirable traits. So if we choose individuals, allow them to breed, then they will hopefully pass on the alleles that we desire to their offspring. And then we can use their offspring to produce the next generation. And this has to generally happen over a number of generations. This causes evolution and provides evidence that natural selection also leads to evolution. So if we look at the fact that selective breeding changes the allele frequency in the gene pool, then we can see that natural selection also does that. This picture here shows what chickens used to look like in 1957 and how we've selectively bred them to be far bigger and produce more meat for human consumption. Okay, homologous structures. So this is probably a new term. Homologous structures are structures within different species that have a similar structure but a very different function. They evolve by adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is when organisms change over a period of time, like a certain group of organisms changes over a period of time to adapt to their environment. And then there's another group of organisms also adapting to a different environment. However, they did used to have a common ancestor. The best example of this, and the IB's favourite example, is pentadactyl limbs. Now, pentadactyl limbs are limbs that have 5 digits. So, for example, our hands have 5 digits, so they're pentadactyl limbs. But also, there's a number of examples. You can see in this table up here, there's a number of examples. I've also put here flippers in penguins, the wings of birds. Oh, there is a bird there. A frog. Oh, there is a frog. The frog's legs and human hands, as I said. Also, it might be worth remembering that if you're answering a longish question, then giving an example often gets you an extra mark. Okay, Speciation is the emergence of a new species. Students tend to forget the definition of speciation, so just kind of try and keep it in your head. It's worth remembering as well that only members of the same species can breed to produce fertile offspring, so that's the definition of a species, is if they can breed to produce fertile offspring. Now, if you have a look at this picture here, we've started off with these salamanders in Northern California, and as you move down, all the way down to here, into Southern California, these two salamanders have adapted to the different conditions in the west and the east of California, and therefore they have evolved and they've become so different that they can no longer breed to produce fertile offspring. So these two salamanders are now different species, and they have evolved from this common ancestor here from the north of California. Okay, a couple more definitions for you. So divergent evolution is when organisms with a common ancestor adapt to different environments. So this example of speciation here is an example of divergent evolution, whereas convergent evolution is when two seemingly unrelated species develop a feature that have the same purpose. So for example, bees and birds both have wings, but they evolved very differently, only because there was a need to be able to fly for both species. Okay, final slide. So industrial melanism, lots of you will have come across this before, and this is where there were a number of moths in the 1800s. So there were black moths and there were lighter speckled moths. Now, in this picture here, this is the bark of the tree in the early 1800s. You can see that it's quite white and speckled, and therefore the moths are camouflaged. If you look very closely, this here is a white moth. So it's actually really quite difficult to see. And this here is a black moth, which is far easier to see on that speckled bark. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, the pollution increased air pollution increased, and the bark of the trees became far darker. So you can see that after the bark of the trees became darker, the dark moth is now actually far better camouflaged than the speckled moth. So therefore, the dark moths were able to survive, reproduce, and pass on the alleles for the darker colour, whereas these ones were then the easy prey for predators, and the numbers declined of the speckled moths. It's actually gone back up now, so it's kind of even between the speckled and the dark moths, I think. Okay, finally, continuous variation. So this is continuous variation here. This picture just kind of compares continuous and discontinuous variation. So as species diverge, it's expected that there will be individuals within a wide range for a specific trait. So a really nice example is human height. So human height, you get very few very small people, very few very tall people. The majority of people falling into the average category. So within a whole population, you have a wide range of heights, most of them, however, being average. And what this means is in a population where there is a large range, sometimes there may be environmental changes which then select for one of the extremes, so either the extreme at this end or the extreme at this end. And that's when evolution and divergence is able to then take place, when the environment changes and these extremes are then favoured for. And that's all for today.